We're going to talk about Varian Fry, and I basically want to divide the hour into three parts. One is we'll just cover the story of Varian Fry, who he was, what he did. Then I want to talk about what Dara wrote about Varian Fry, because I think her essay is really, really powerful. And although you'll get a version of that on Yom HaShoah, because there'll be a version of that will be the talk that she'll give at, there we go. Version of that will be the talk that she gives at Westside Presbyterian Church for our Yom HaShoah service. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the Julie Oranger's novel about Varian Fry. So, first questions. First of all, how many have read what Dara wrote about Varian Fry? A few. Okay. How many of you followed my advice and did your homework and read the extra credit novel? No. Nobody. Okay. Fine. That's fine. It's one. So we'll get to that. So those are the three things. The three things that I want to cover for today. And wait 1 second. Is, you know what? It was a very important piece of paper that I needed. Okay. We'll take a 10-second break. Be right back. Was this laptop? Okay, we'll have to turn off the mic because it's still set for the back room. It's supposed to only be this room, but we had the comedy night last night and the microphone PA needed to be reconfigured, which it wasn't. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you can read me, you can hear me. It's going to be hard, I know, for people. You know what? I think I do. People watching on the live stream, they're not going to be able to hear me without the mic. All right. Okay. If people hear me in the back room, find Jose and ask him to fix it. Otherwise, we will, I don't know what I did with a piece of paper, so I apologize for that. It's okay, I'll find it if I have it on my phone. So, starting with Varian Fry. And so I'm going to briefly cover the basic story, because part of the point that Dara Horn makes in her essay is that before she was in the research, she had not heard of Varian Fry, and a very important role that, although more and more people are learning about him over time, is not as well known as certainly not, well, I mean, if Steven Spielberg made a movie about Fry instead of Schindler, then we would all know more about Varian Fry. So some of that it takes, and then it's like novels like this and other publications will increase the knowledge of Varian Fry. I think I first learned about Varian Fry when I moved to Ridgewood, and someone said, "You know, this is where Varian Fry was. You heard of Varian Fry?" And I said, "No." And then this person said, "You never heard of Varian Fry?" I'm not telling you who it was, Jerosa, but right. And then, of course, I learned because Varian Fry, as we know, is from Ridgewood, New Jersey. He wasn't born in Ridgewood. I think he was like 3 years old. His family moved here, but he basically grew up in Ridgewood. And the reason why, one of the main reasons why we share and we alternate the venue for Ridgewood's interfaith Yom HaShoah service with Westside Presbyterian Church is that was the Fry's congregation. And actually in the lobby of the church, there's a photograph of Varian Fry hanging in a very prominent place right in their lobby. And it says, a member of Westside Presbyterian Church rescued 2,000 Jews from the Holocaust. So and the street is called Varian Fry Way, that it's otherwise Monroe, right? But that little piece of it is called Varian Fry Way right in front of Westside. So there is that very important connection with Ridgewood. He was educated at Harvard, worked as a journalist, and that's before his time in France. After his time in France, he He holds a few journalist positions, can't hold a position for more than a year at most. 2 failed the marriages, and then worked as a high school Latin teacher and died in his mid-50s. I think it was like 59 when he died. He's a relatively young man. So his life would not be remarkable, right, except for that 1 year in the middle, right? So he volunteered to go to Marseille in southern France to work for a new organization that was a New York-based organization that was founded just right in the aftermath of the surrender of France to the Nazis in 1940, the summer of 1940, which took everyone by surprise at how rapidly France fell. And remember what happened, the way the Nazis did with France, is that the northern part of France was under German occupation, but the southern part was the Vichy regime, which was the puppet government that worked with the Nazis, and it was semi-autonomous. And there were many people who had, and it's not just in France, but France is the largest of the other European countries, that when people had fled Nazi Germany in peacetime, settled in other European countries, and then the borders of the Nazi state and control then caught up with them later. There were many people, and they thought, they made a decision to leave Germany, and that was a very difficult decision for people to make, to uproot your family, leave your country, said, you know what, we're going to move to France, and then all of a sudden, Germany caught up with me in France. Right? So what the Emergency Rescue Committee was this organization that was funded by New York philanthropists, many of them Jewish, but also from the world of culture, was to rescue artists, painters, writers, musicians, people of the great cultural minds that were in France and were now stuck, right? And now needed to get out before they faced doom, right, from the Nazis, because people knew, and always didn't know what was going on in the Holocaust, but they did know. And they did know what the dangers were. And Varian Fry volunteered to go and be the director, not of the organization, but to be its field director in its Marseille office. And they had a list of, it started off as a list of a few hundred refugees, and his job was to find them and to convince them to leave, and then to help to negotiate on their behalf, to get the visas, to pay for the transit, to house them, to just help them get out of Europe and to America. And the lists were put together from different sources from the committee. Thomas Mann, not Jewish, but yet a most important German writer who had already left Germany before the time, actually listed his recommendations of Jewish artists, people of culture from Germany who should be rescued, and then there were many more. But then Varian Fry exceeded all the expectations. Basically, almost everyone on his list, and then word spread that he was helping people. There was they were talking about the lines outside his office for, say, of refugees coming to seek help, and he ended up saving over 2,000 people, between 2,000 to 2,500 was the number that he saved, that he was directly responsible for, and would have saved more had he not been arrested and deported from France in 1941 after working there for about a year. And then there was the activities that other people he worked for continued it, but the pace slowed down. And he was helped, he had an ally in the U.S. consulate in Marseille. Hiram Begum IV was a consular official who also, along with Varian Fry, he approved all these visas but that consular official was fired because the State Department policy was not to send Jews to America, even famous artists, and the consulate actually worked with the Vichy government to get Varian Fry arrested and sent home. because the State Department was just not interested in engaging. And that's part of the story that Dara talks about with the American anti-Semitism. That's the dark part of the story. But what did he do? So how did he rescue people? Probably the most famous person who was responsible for getting out was Chagall. And the most famous person that he didn't get out was Walter Benjamin, a very important German Jewish philosopher who then took his life about right when he was arrested by the Gestapo. But you can look up the list. It's a long list, and made a tremendous influence, and according to many, was one of the things that that made New York a seat of cosmopolitan world culture, starting in this period, the 1940s, was because of all of these great artists that were brought here through the efforts of Varian Fry, and really not many other people. Who was here in Bingham the Fourth, who was the consular official. He also came from a very Protestant WASPy line like Varian Fry. His grandfather was a Protestant missionary in Hawaii, Bingham. His father was the discoverer of Machu Picchu, and then was a senator from Connecticut. So that was the other, and it's part of it is also the coincidence that Varian might have been looking for something to do, some adventure. Varian Fry, and he must have saw an ad for this. He says, that sounds exciting, and he ends up being, doing tremendous work, and also the right person sitting at the right desk in the U.S. consulate until he was removed, and there was a partnership there. So the main part was getting the visas to enter the United States, because there was anti-Semitism, right, against just not giving visas to Jews. There was this thing that you couldn't enter the United States unless there was a guarantee that you wouldn't be a public charge. In this case, this committee was raising money and basically another work to get the financial guarantees. But you didn't only need the U.S. entry visa, you also needed the exit visa from France. And part of Vichy's arrangement with Nazi Germany was that they would agree to repatriate to Germany people that had illegally escaped Germany, mostly Jews, right? Original German citizenship, who the Nazis were through the process, and it took over a year trying to track everyone down over time and bring people back to Germany, eventually to the camps, obviously, in Eastern Europe after that. So how do you get the exit visa to allow you to cross the border to leave Vichy? And then how do you get into the United States? And then how do you get across the ocean in wartime? You didn't have ships going directly from Marseille to New York. So for a number of these people, they did is that they would go by train and then cross the border to Spain, and then travel across Spain, go to Portugal, and go to Lisbon, and then get a ship from Lisbon. So you have to get through a neutral country, but that meant that you also needed visas for Spain and Portugal. So that a lot of paperwork, and some of them they were able to get this paperwork officially, and in other cases they were phony passports, which was one of the reasons why Varian Fry ended up being arrested, because he was involved with illegal activity that the U.S. consulate had to disavow itself of in the fake documents that were brought out. And there were people, a lot of fake Czech passports, and then other fake visas from Vichy that he worked, and there was a lot of bribing was done and a lot of smooth talking. And one of the ways I understand it is that he was just a very assertive, smooth-talking, educated, WASPy American, right, who was able to work with the French, with the Spanish, and able to get things done by greasing palms, and and people work with. This was a Harvard-educated American, and so there was that aura about him that he was able to project and use to the benefit of the good work that he did. There was a former cowboy, like a Western cowboy, his name John Bull, who worked for him and brought people illegally across the border when they couldn't get the paperwork to enter Spain. There was a route through the Pyrenees Mountains, and Franz Werfel, who was a great German Jewish writer, and his wife, Alma, who also had been married to Mahler, the great composer, and then the brother, sister-in-law, and son of Thomas Mann were also in this group. And they managed to trek over the mountains in the Pyrenees with this guide, who was an American guide working for Varian Fry to get to the other side. Extraordinary story. One of several, and there are others, people getting through in ships and all different ways. And it's one of, and at the end of Dara Horn's account, and it's more like the biographical part for Varian Fry, when he died in his apartment in Connecticut from a heart attack, and he didn't show up at his high school class that day, so they called his ex-wife. She had just gotten divorced the week before, 2 weeks before, so she called the police in Connecticut. They found him dead in his bed, and he had been working on his memoir, and the police report said it was an abridgment of his memoir, and the police officer said it was apparently a work of fiction. Because it's such an unbelievable story. The thing they did, the officer in Connecticut that found it was 1967 when he died, just assumed he was working on a work of fiction. So that somehow the stories are so amazing, they can't possibly be true because it's that extraordinary. And that was that one year of his life. So that's the story of Varian Fry. I want to just pull this up on the phone because I'm sorry, I have the piece of paper in my hand. I don't know where I put it.
How old was he when he died? 59.
59. Yeah.
Also worth noting that Thomas Mann's wife was Jewish.
Thomas Mann's wife was Jewish. Yes, she was Jewish. That's true.
And the Alma that you
Yeah, which was one of the reasons why they left. One of the reasons they had already left before, just because the political situation was.
Also, the story of Thomas Mann novelized is The Magician by Ian.
Yeah, that was, I read, and Varian Fry makes an appearance in that novel. Who's the author? He's
Ian Ewan, I think.
Yeah. It's called The Magician. It came out a year and a half ago. It's similar to Julia Oranger's book about Varian Fry. It's a novel, this historical fiction biography. There's like a genre now to do a novel that's about real people, right? So it makes you turn the pages faster than a hardcore biography, maybe, depends on who the biographer is. And that's about Thomas Mann. It deals with Thomas Mann's story. Varian Fry makes his way into it. Yeah.
Well, and like Schindler, after he had, this year of greatness, when he came here, he had trouble finding a job.
Yeah.
He was, poor.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to do a portfolio from the artists who he had saved, and they contacted Chagall and all these other people to contribute, and they
To Varian Fry.
Yeah, well, somebody else on his behalf.
Right.
And they refused
Right,
to
and
do
that's
it.
the story that Dara Horn tells, that the people that he rescued were not overwhelmingly appreciative after the fact. When he was alive, they wouldn't take his phone calls. He was trying to put together a folio to raise money for a new humanitarian organization. It was the year before he died. And then later to put in his memory, and they just was very, very hesitant. The idea of that, the novel's called The Flight Portfolio. It's a fictional character that's working to put together artistic examples from all the different artists that were saved or or on their way or still refugees, to demonstrate to the world. This is sort of a traveling exhibit about the artistic, what's in danger, the cultural in danger in Europe, and that's what it's called, The Flight Portfolio, which is a fictional collection. But there was an attempt to make a real one, and they were just not cooperative. And Horn gives a few reasons why. I'll talk to that in a minute, Jackie.
There's another wonderful book that was published in the 90s called A Hero of Our Own.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the Varian Fry story. It's really excellent. The author is Sheila Eisenberg.
Okay.
And I think I have the book, and it's signed by her because she was brought, she came to Ridgewood. And it's just an amazing story.
Yeah.
It's really...
Yeah, that's one. There's about, I think, 3 different biographies of Varian Fry, and that's one of them. That's a nonfiction, right.
But it's compelling. It's very interesting to read. And it's not fictional at all.
Yeah.
This is reminiscent as well of The Sound of Music, and also Casablanca, both dealing with people trying to escape.
Yeah, no, right. Sound of Music, Casablanca, that whole genre of the escape, refugees, and getting out, and part of it is the people not realizing yet the need to escape and being resistant to escape, and then finally when they are, and then having, and then the type of real drama, you know, in trying to slip through the remaining cracks.
Correct,
Yeah.
the magician is Colin Tobin.
Colin Tobin, that's the author. Yes, yeah, that's right. That's right, The Magician. Yeah, I'm going to come back to that also. I almost brought it, but I didn't. I think that you were ahead of me, though. I should have. So just about his legacy, and this was what I had printed up, and it's from. It's just a list of how he was appreciated that the Wikipedia article puts together. The most important thing is there's no appreciation of Varian Fry until after he dies. Right, so it was the opposite, right? The State Department completely disavowed himself and worked with Vichy to get him deported and arrested. And the people he rescued didn't appreciate him. No one appreciated him in his life. But then the understanding grows more posthumously. So the first acknowledgement is in '67. I think that's right after he died. The government of France inducted him to the Legion of Honor, which is the highest honor in France. And then I'll just go through these, not all of them. And then it's in 1991 that the United States Holocaust Memorial Council awarded him the Eisenhower Liberation Medal. So his official American recognition is 1991. And then 1994 is acknowledged by Yad Vashem as the first American, there are now 5, but he was the first American who's recognized as a righteous among the Gentiles in Yad Vashem. So if you've been to Yad Vashem, you know there's that, where before you, the other little ones, and then on the left of the main museum, it's called the Avenue of the Righteous. That's just long series of like trees, and each tree, and then around the sign, they each have a plaque on it. So there's for acknowledging all the righteous of the Gentiles, and it's so like Raoul Wallenberg is there, and Oskar Schindler is there. So Varian Fry was acknowledged in 1994, and when I was in our first Temple Israel trip with the then mayor of Ridgewood, Paul Aronson, so a former member of Temple Israel, was with me on the group, and then we went to find the Varian Fry plaque in the Avenue of the Righteous of the Gentiles at Yad Vashem, and we found it there. So sort of the back as it was later, most of it was put in earlier in the 50s and 60s. It took till 1994 that he was recognized. When they did recognize that in 1994, Secretary Christopher, the Secretary of State at the time, under Clinton, Warren Christopher, right, was there representing the Secretary of State came for the unveiling of that plaque, which is very, very telling that Secretary of State did that, because Varian Fry was like really completely disavowed by the State Department. They left him to be arrested. And it's a miracle that he was deported. He could have been easily sent to a concentration camp. And the State Department says, we told you to leave, you stayed. We told you not to save Jews. So then, years later in 1994, the Secretary of State at the time is there when Yad Vashem does it. It's a little plaque. It's only this big, but it's in the garden with the other righteous Gentiles.
There's a tree also.
The plaque's in front of the tree. Yeah. When I was there, the tree wasn't that big yet.
No.
It grew a bit since then. Yeah, let me just go through 1 second. So hold on, I just want to go through the rest of the list of how he's acknowledged, and then I see Brian. So that's 1994, and then in 1998. So that's from Yad Vashem, which is the institution in Israel that does Holocaust, like the U.S. Holocaust Museum. In 1998, he's officially recognized by the government of the State of Israel. He's made a commemorative citizen. He was given posthumous Israeli honorary citizenship in 1998. And then in 2002, the U.S. Consul General in Marseille, his name is Samuel Brock, was instrumental in having the city of Marseille rename the square where the U.S. consulate is in Marseille, and that's called Place Varian Fry. which is cool, right? So that was and again, it shows between like the U.S. consulate and the local Marseille government recognizing that this was a great man who they both really worked against at the time. So that's 2002. In 2005, there was the first street named after him is in Berlin. So there's a central part of Berlin called Potsdamer Platz, which is now where like the only place in Berlin where they have modern skyscrapers, because it was the land that was kind of like the no man's land where the border was between East Berlin and West Berlin. And it was only built up in around the early 2000s, was then in the redevelopment city with becoming the new capital, Germany, and it's where there's a big giant Sony center there where all the modern movie theaters are and the casino hotels. And then so right there in the new downtown of Berlin, there's a Varian Fry way there. So a little street there is names. I actually stumbled on it by accident. I was in Berlin to spend a lot of time there because I teach rabbinical school, and then I went to Potsdamer Platz to see the new James Bond movie or something, who knows? and then the bus stop, I go to the bus stop, look at the signs, a Varian Fry way. And in Berlin, whenever the streets are named after people, it also gives it tells you who the person was, and then there's also a whole plaque there, like a hard plastic sign in German and English that's like 3 full paragraphs that tells you who he is and about Varian Fry. Again, he worked in France, he didn't work in Berlin, but acknowledgement in what was the capital of Nazi Germany is very significant. But again, that was 2005. And then the same year, I think, perhaps shamed by Berlin, the Ridgewood Village Council decided to name that little piece of Monroe in front of Westside Presbyterian Church Varian Fry Way. So,
And that's thanks to Catherine Tao.
Right.
thanks to Catherine Tao, okay. Yeah, did she know that they did it in Berlin, or is it just a coincidence?
She was involved, I think, in trying to get a street named in New York City,
And she
and
did
might have
it.
been involved in Marseille.
Yeah, but it has to be also because then once Berlin did it, then she was able to then shame our village council here, and they didn't have Councilman Weitz there
Can
at
you
the
not
time.
repeat that tactic, please?
Can we? Yes. So those both were 2005, and then there was a resolution in 2007 from the House of Representatives honoring him, which was the 100th anniversary of his birth, because he was born in 1907. And then the last thing that, it's not really an acknowledgement, but they recognized 2019 was when this book came out, which we'll talk about. So that's sort of the biographical sketch. Brian, keep your hand up before.
Oh, I was just going to comment that very much to her, Dara Horn's point, right, that Secretary of State Warren Christopher wasn't exactly letting in Somali refugees or Mexican refugees. He just showed up to sign a plaque for a dead person. Because, to her point, we love all these people after they die. But when they're alive, we don't really like them.
Right.
Yeah, we don't.
Right, and in fact, and that was also right when Varian Fry failed to get the artists who he rescued to contribute to a portfolio, was in 1965 when he was trying to raise money to help refugees in the mid-60s, right? Of people, again, that right then needed saving, and the very people whom he saved were not helping him save others. Right, so, but at least Warren Christopher, at least he showed up for Jerusalem for the plaque.
Maybe. I mean, wouldn't it have been more if he had allowed in 5,000 Somali refugees?
Yeah. No, that's true. So let's talk about what Dara Horn says about it. It was very uncomfortable. I mean, first of all, she explains how the artists and others were unappreciative of him, and she points out how the Varian Fry put out so much. It wasn't his own money; it was money that he was raising. But he put out so much money to help these refugees get started in America, and then they became wealthy, some of them, and then didn't contribute back to the organization that helped them out. It doesn't make the refugees look very good. But her real point, though, is not to criticize refugees. I mean, she's really just criticizing how we understand the real righteous acts that he did and why there's a discomfort with it. So I want to go through a few of the points that she makes here. It's the central chapter of her book, chapter 8, is the longest chapter by far. You know, it's about 60 pages. But she doesn't put a lot of words on the page, so it shouldn't scare you. And of course, she mentions that he's from Ridgewood, New Jersey, which is great. And then just what he accomplished, right, is important. She said it was because of the people Fry saved, New York became, this is on page 116, became the international center of the post-war art world. Because of the people Fry saved, American universities became the premier research institutions on earth. Because of the people Fry saved, Hollywood was reconfigured into global hegemony. Varian Fry essentially saved not only thousands of people, but the culture of Europe. Weren't we supposed to have seen the... Okay, so, and that's what's motivating him. She may be overstating it in some sense, but he wanted to go to rescue Western culture, right? Because the great minds of Western culture were being mortally endangered by the Nazis. So he went to save that and bring that back to America. And then America then takes the role sort of in the leadership of culture where that had been Europe before the war. So from a perspective of cultural history, it's an extraordinary, you know, in terms of what he did, what he accomplished.
Prior to the war, a lot of scientists came over and were instrumental in the atom bomb process.
Yes, the scientists, and then philosophers. So the new school in Lower Manhattan are all those of German Jewish emigres. That's the Frankfurt School, was that group of philosophers that transplanted and organized the new school. So we have, in all of the different areas of the arts and academia, the amount of brain trust, a sense, that's moved over is extraordinary, and how much of that is due to this one individual. And again, even when nobody took his place, right? They couldn't find anybody. It's the right person in the right time by accident and did the right thing. That's what makes the story so extraordinary, not just the maneuvers through the mountains and the Indiana Jones style of story. Yeah, Joe.
But she says his motivation is to save European culture.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember reading the Andy Marino biography.
Yeah, that's the best biography.
And
yeah.
he made the point that Fry had been in, I believe, France when Kristallnacht happened, and he was so
It was in
horrified.
France. He was in Berlin in 1935.
And he was so
Yeah.
horrified
Yes.
by what he saw that
Yeah.
that's what he
Yeah.
attributes the motivation for volunteering
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah, she probably doesn't emphasize, that's true. She doesn't emphasize that. That is, he was in Berlin in 1935, and he witnessed a very violent actions against the persecution and violent beating up of Jews in the street, and it had a tremendous effect on him. And he wrote an article on it, it's published in the Time, and you could link it. I mean, it's still...
And it was virtually ignored.
And it was virtually ignored. Right.
So,
It was virtually ignored, and probably the version that the Times published was probably edited and sanitized a bit from what he really saw.
and the thing about him is that it was really, it was truly more of an altruistic thing to do. Because he really was at risk. His life was at risk the entire
Right.
time he was there.
Right.
And that's why you can't find a replacement for that. Because
Right.
you need to find someone who's just as altruistic and
Right.
willing to risk their life.
Yeah, and that
And
was
those
always
people-
frustrating for him, and that everything, it was a matter of life and death.
And nobody saw it that way.
Right, and Dara Horn's she's not criticizing him or the culture, she's making a subtle argument just against American anti-Semitism, others in general, so we'll get to her point, but it's right, that is, it's not just that he was interested in Western culture, he personally witnessed Nazi violence, and that moved him, and he saw it, and he just saw it for what it was. Yeah.
Was Highest part of the funding for Varian Fry?
No, Highest was because they were doing the same kind of thing, right? So Highest was on the.
Involved with him?
I don't know. It was parallel, not coordinated.
It was the International
Yeah.
Rescue.
Yeah, there were a few other organizations. This was one of them, and what his organization was specifically for artists and cultural resources. Yeah,
So Kristallnacht is 35.
38.
30, it's 30.
Kristallnacht was November 9th to 38.
Okay.
It was not Kristallnacht, but it was a violent in Berlin that he recognized, that he was witness.
Was the emigration to France, to southern France, to Marseille, was it just our last hope, or was there a realistic sense that we're safe?
Well, some of the people he wasn't able to get. I mean, he had to meet with these people and convince them you have to leave, and they said, oh no, we're safe, and then later they realized they're not because things continue to get worse rather than get better. When he was in France was before the tide of the war changed, before the Stalingrad, right? So right now the Nazis are moving towards Moscow, they're solidifying Europe. It's every day things look worse and worse and worse. So that was the context under which he was working there. So he saw it was like, you need to get out now. And the process which took a few months to plan, but that was the circumstances.
And Chagall gave him a hard time about leaving.
Yes. Yeah, he said, oh, I'll be okay, I'm Chagall, and, until eventually then they did leave.
And Hitler takes over France in, 6 weeks or something? I mean,
Yes, this July 1940. July 1940, it happened very fast. Yeah. One thing when she's talking about Leon Feuchtwanger, who's one of the most accomplished German Jewish writers, she points out in her just a little thing that I wanted to just say was that she, in her edition of his book, the Oppermanns, which is a book about a German Jewish family that then meets their demise through and eventually exiles or is killed at the time the Nazis come to power. She says, I saw a hint of the scope of the author's note that appears in the first page of the book. It says, after the type of this volume had already been set, a family by the name of Oppermann advised the publisher that Oppermann is a strictly Christian name, and that they would therefore like to have it avoided that bearers of the name Oppermann be branded before the general public as belonging to a Jewish family. Because the book was published in 1933. In view of the existing circumstances, the publisher readily understands this attitude on the part of the Oppermann family and herewith advises the readers of this novel of the facts which the Oppermann family wishes to have readily understood. It's a very clever statement from the publisher, kind of sticking it back to this Oppermann, who was a Nazi and didn't like the fact that he had the same last name as the Jewish family in this book that was becoming an international bestseller. What she didn't realize when she wrote that is that the first edition of the book, the title was changed to Oppenheimer's, not Oppermann, because the publisher was afraid. And she talks about courage, and it would make her argument even stronger. She doesn't even realize that the publisher wasn't as courageous. They only got more courageous with the second edition when the book was a great bestseller. They knew they then chose what side to be on. And there's a whole history, and this goes with Thomas Mann also, with those that were publishing books that were not friendly to the Nazis, how the publishing houses handled it, where they were published, outside of Nazi Germany, but yet still to be sold, and what the future was for selling books in Germany in the early years of the Nazis is a very, very complicated story also. That was a side point that I just wanted to point out. So, let me just see what else I got before we go to the other book. She talks about interviewing this guy, Paul Savage, who's a French-American documentary filmmaker, lives in California, and he's apparently been working on a documentary about Varian Fry for the last 20 years. He has a website, it's kind of very amateurish, but he has all his notes there and pictures, and she went to interview him, and a lot of her essay is really taking him to task because she disagrees with the way that he understands Varian Fry, and then she takes a more critical look, not at him personally, but of the story around it. But a lot of her essay is based on it's a refraction of the interview that she had with this guy, though, who's a private filmmaker that's devoted so much, it's kind of obsessed with Varian Fry. Varianfry.org. Savage's website with all of his all the materials about him. And so one of the things we're talking about is why he's so unknown in the U.S. And this is the crux of her argument. She says because it reveals the U.S. complicity in the Holocaust. So in his words, he said, we live on two myths, that we didn't know and that we couldn't do anything even if we did know. And the story of Varian Fry upends those two myths. It says, A, we did know, and and rather than, and the State Department went out of its way to not help Jews, except with it, and Varian Fry and Hiram Bigham in the consulate are the exceptions that prove the rule. Not one consular official that was willing to work with him. And then this understanding a rescuer, right? So one of the things they say is that the stories of rescuers that we find most satisfying, this Savage argues, are those in which rescuers agonize over what they were doing, wondering whom to save. And that's sort of a trope, and it's in Varian Fry's. So it's in, like, if you remember, there's a very, very moving scene at the very end of Schindler's List, where in the movie, where Schindler starts to break down and cry that he could have saved more people. He was being too careful, right? He could have saved this person, could have saved that person. And this, so with the way, either through snippets of places where quotations from Varian Fry himself, from his writings, from people that spoke with him, and then all the writings about him. So there's a look in terms of, did he agonize over that? Because the problem with the story of Varian Fry, and Dara Horn takes this straight on in her essay, is that why are artists more important than other people? And that's why she goes out of the point by saying these artists are artistes. They don't care about him. They're stuck up on their own success. They're not the greatest, they're not the people that he needed to rescue. Right? Part of this is also her thing of just like lashing out against secular Western culture as being devoid of morality, which is part of her, argument, or righteousness, which she calls in her argument. But there's that issue, right? It was who's to decide who's worth saving and who's not worth saving. And there are evidence of him, of Varian Fry himself, baiting over that. Savage is more apologetic for Varian Fry than Dara Horn is, and she said, look, he was hired to do, and he worked with the resources that he had. Another quote from the paper here from 140, she says, the unarticulated and more disturbing idea here is that rescuers like Fry do not actually call into question the premise that innocent people are doomed to be murdered. Instead, such stories simply reveal that the most righteous people available could do no more than provide for a tiny number of people the possibility of remaining alive. In this sense, rescuer stories are the opposite of inspirational. They are stories that make painfully clear everything that might have been. She's saying that there's a dark side. The story of a rescuer, we wanted, those are feel-good stories, right? Why does Steven Spielberg pick Oskar Schindler to be his Holocaust movie? Because he wants to show this sense of, this optimism, this sense of human triumph. But Dara Horn's looking at the dark side of that those are the exceptions that prove the rule, right? That most people don't stand and step into the breach and do the right thing. And when you have this story, and this is you have the righteous of the Gentiles, but this sort of, Yad Vashem is the beautiful avenue of the righteous of the Gentiles. There's a few hundred people who are listed there, as opposed to the hundreds of millions of people in the world who were not listed, who are alive at the time. So that's what she's drawing our attention to. That it talks about the possibility of how much more goodness could have been done if there were more people than that, and the tragedy that there weren't. So then there's a quotation from, this was one of his expressions of remorse. It's a conversation with Mary Jane Gold, who was one of his associates, and she wrote a memoir about her experience with Varian Fry, and it mentions in his story Marc Chagall. So it says, one of those arrested was Marc Chagall. In high dudgeon, Fry contacted the police, yelled at them for arresting one of the world's greatest living artists. He marched to the police precinct and basically yelled at the prefecture of police and says, you must release Marc Chagall. I mean, the chutzpah that he had, And if the news of his arrest should leak out, the whole world will be shocked, Fry informed them. Half an hour later, Chagall was free. And Varian Fry's team rejoiced, but Mary Jane Gold spotted Fry wiping his glasses, muttering under his breath, no, we should be able to save them all. Why just the world's greatest painter? So in her recollection, now again, that's her memory way after the fact of something he said that she was witness to. But she's testifying, at least in her memoir, that even at this point of great triumph, he was conflicted, right? Because he knew he was able to make that argument to get Chagall out of prison, but he wasn't able to make it for so many others that were in prison. So she recognizes, she says on page 147, he was genuinely anguished over the fate of the thousand, even millions whom he had been forced to leave behind. And that's also one of the issues why he's not so well celebrated, just as Americans want to hear about their own heroism, not about their failures. And that while Varian Fry is a hero, his story tells the story of America's failure. Right? Because the State Department was not supportive of him, and the United States did not do, it could have done so much more, especially before it entered the war, right? When it was a neutral player. And it could have been part of the arguments they made. The State Department said that, that Dulles' argument was that we need to secure influence for the Vichy government. We need to make sure that the military resources of Vichy aren't just given to the Nazis, so we don't want to antagonize them with saving all these Jews. So that was, the arguments then, but that's, yeah.
Just want to say, years ago when the exhibit about Varian Fry came to the Ridgewood Library, and thousands, hundreds of kids saw that exhibit, Catherine Taub became aware of a family in Teaneck, regular people who he had saved. Jennifer Berman, I think was her name, and she came to one of the services. So this was, somebody who wasn't famous, an artist who survived because of Fry.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe only one of a few.
Right, and that's so as someone, so she found in Teaneck, just repeat, that was not necessarily a famous artist who was saved by Varian Fry. And that's part of the story, right? And that's part of the story why, again, State Department and then even the own organization in New York pulled their support for him because he exceeded his mandate. Right? He kept finding more, so even though he was hard on himself because he could have saved so much more, he expanded it, and he did everything he could to stay. They told him to come home. He refused the orders of his own company to come home. They sent a replacement. He sabotaged the replacement. He was ordered to leave by the government. Instead, he kind of went to others, thought he could escape, and they would forget about it. He kept thinking that Chicago has other people to worry about. They're not going to care about some waspy Jew from waspy American from Ridgewood, New Jersey. I'm not at the top of their list. And he did. He managed to extend his time there, probably by another few months, until eventually he was kicked out.
But I hazard to say that of the 2,000 or 2,500, I've always heard about 2,000 people he did save, they weren't all, 2,000 weren't all great minds and artists and everything. There were quite a number of people, ordinary people, that heard about his, and like that family in Teaneck.
But most of them had some type of artistic credentials to get the aid organization to pay the money for it, and also was part of the reasons to get the visas for the entry to the United States. So there had to be that was the avenue that he was using. I don't think he concocted any of them. It wasn't like Schindler who said this person is a specialist arms. It wasn't, he made up these things to put people on the list. But yeah, it's complicated. Yeah.
Do any of these books get involved with what the President Roosevelt could have done or should have done?
So Eleanor Roosevelt was supportive of the organization and was one of the contacts that he had. Franklin, not as much. No. Yeah. But he did have to go along with Eleanor.
Just saying.
So to an extent, he was. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned it before, and apologies if you're going to hit upon it, but I'm interested in the reluctance of these 2,000 to actually help him after the war.
Yeah.
And I recall reading, I read the book last year, something, folks just didn't want to remind themselves of the horrors they've been through, which to me strikes me as a bit of a cop-out.
Yep.
But what was the thinking as to why these 2,000 people wouldn't recognize him when he was alive?
Yeah, I mean, she gives some theories on that. I mean, part of it is that when you've gone through a trauma, you want to move on. That's part of it. One explanation is also that when you're artist, you think of yourself as a very important person, so it's difficult to remember a time when you were totally dependent on somebody else. You don't want to, face that. They don't want to face the fact that they maybe They needed to be convinced to leave, that they couldn't read the handwriting on the wall. It's just the psychology of us being a survivor is always very complicated, you know. And then many survivors show up, many, you know, they like to talk about it, but probably many more just didn't, and it was just easier to, and then because they were able to latch themselves on to new productive lives, they didn't want it, so they moved. I think the most charitable way to understand it is they moved on from that point in their lives. The uncharitable way is that they were stuck-up artists, which she implies also. And you can't generalize, because they're all different people. They're all different people.
It still strikes me as a cop-out, and it adds to the tragedy of the story.
It adds to the tragedy.
And I think
Right.
maybe as you should own the fact that those folks should have done more.
Yeah, right. But why didn't they do more to acknowledge the person who saved them? Yeah, that is true.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's, you know, you talk to people who are cancer survivors, right? And they stay in touch with the doctor, and they donate to the hospital,
Right.
and they, even though that is the same thing, right? It's another person saving you, and that emotion doesn't seem to be.
And it doesn't seem to be that, right. And it's just a more complicated relationship, and it's a good point. You said like cancer survivors, even so I do funerals all the time, it's part of my job. And one of the things at a funeral is say, what donation do you want to recommend? People donation in memory of the person who died. And more than 9 out of 10 times, it's whatever research organization is involved in what the person died from. It was cancer, or diabetes, or Alzheimer's, or whatever it is. It's just, oh, this is that organization. And they're not survivors, right? These are people that died from the disease. And yet that is what people remember when they want to contribute. And this was the opposite, right? Where they didn't want that connection with what they survived from, which is fascinating. Yeah, and that's what makes her essay so difficult, you know, and really, really makes us think, you know, and that's part of the argument she's making. Many of those rescues declined to even acknowledge their rescuer in later years. This was partly because they simply wanted to forget the greatest horror of their lives. That's one. And then she talks about Dara Hornen, a discussion she has with Hannah Stein, who's a German Jewish journalist. She said, I'll read you from here, it's from page 152, with whom I shared my bafflement about the legacy of Varian Fry. What she told me, Stein argued that this type of resentment was completely natural, and he offered his own country as a prime example. Germans in general hate America, he says. And they have 3 reasons to be grateful to America. 1, America saved them from themselves by defeating the Nazis. 2, America rebuilt their country after the war with the Marshall Plan. And 3, America saved them from the Soviets. She says, and that's exactly why Germans hate America, because they're indebted to America for these 3 existential things, so that's why they like America. And all they do is criticize America. America's culture, American government's terrible, America's this and that. As an American, I'm in Germany all the time. I'm like, oh, you guys understand? Show a little gratefulness, show a little appreciation, but instead, you know, yes.
I was thinking about their lack of wanting to acknowledge him as the person who got them out. And it occurs to me that there might be some shame involved on the part of the people who have been saved. You know, it's a bit counterintuitive. However, they may be walking around their lives with a bit of shame over having been saved. Why me? Why not someone else?
Right, and that's the survivor guilt, right? Survivor guilt, like, why was I saved? Why didn't I fate the fate of others? Or it could be shame because they needed rescuing, and had they had more foresight, they could have left before they needed Varian Fry.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that out loud by thanking Varian Fry in public with accolades and carrying him on their shoulders would to give light to that shame.
Yeah. And I think Horn understands that, so the next, she has this same, also Bono 152, she has the shame, she uses shame, she said. See? The shame is only highlighted by the enormous difference in the experience of the rescuers and the rescued. For those rescued, it was the worst time of their lives, when their lives had the least significance. For the rescuers, it was the best time of their lives, when their lives mattered most. It was the best year of Varian Fry's life. It was the year that he was fully alive. You know, the rest of his year, he was a failed journalist, a failed husband, has 2 children. His daughter, even when she tried to speak, wouldn't even speak about her father. His son said he had mental illness his whole life.
Well, there's two things I see on Google right now, because one is his first wife died, it says. I don't know if that's true, but it says his first wife died, his second one was divorced. And the other one, that there was speculation that
I think she
might
died
have-
after he died. I think it was after the
After
divorce.
the divorce.
But it was a difficult marriage.
Oh.
It wasn't, yeah.
And if somebody I don't know, speculated he might be gay, but it says he
I'll
might
get
be
to
gay,
that.
but who cares?
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah. Yes.
I had read once that it was Adolf Eichmann being arrested in Argentina.
Yeah.
That seemed to be the catapult to Holocaust literature, Holocaust
Yeah.
acceptance. And I don't know if it was the combination of time, that it took 15 years for Holocaust survivors
Right.
to kind of tell their story. I mean,
Right.
Giselle did it.
Yeah, we'll talk about
It was
that.
Eichmann arrest that kind
Yeah.
of got everything.
So we'll talk about that a bit next week. We'll talk about memorializing the Holocaust in America. The Eichmann trial, which was publicized, was very important in terms of public opinion in both Germany and the United States in dealing with Holocaust memory and acknowledging it and talking more about the Holocaust. But again, that was the mid-60s. He's not acknowledged until the 90s. It took another 30 years for the acknowledgement to happen with Varian Fry. So it's a little more complicated. But yeah, the Eichmann trial is a very important. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that next week for sure. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, well, we'll get to that and talk about that. At the end of her point, she says that her argument, which she pulls together at the end of the essay, so you got to get to the end of Dara Horn's essay, is she said that he's like a prophet, right, and that he's a little crazy, but he's calling out evil, and he's standing up for righteousness. And her argument is that that's not valued in Western culture. She's very critical of her alma mater. What she has in common with Varian Fry, besides they're both from northern New Jersey, and they both went to Harvard. And she said that Harvard teaches you a lot of things, teaches you how to think, but it doesn't teach you righteousness, goodness, and morality. So she's critical of her, the moral relativism that she imbued as a student there, and that kind of comes out a bit, her critique there in this essay. And she says, the real reason that no one today has heard of Varian Fry is because the gift he had is not one that we value. And then she has this section where she says, why weren't people instead of saving artists of Western culture where there's a moral relativism, why didn't people rescue the Jews who studied righteousness, like the whole Hasidim and Misnagdic culture? And so there's a little bit of a rant there. It's not entirely fair. Abraham Joshua Heschel was rescued by Hebrew Union College. They paid for his rescue out of Berlin. And he was one of the most important thinkers in the history of conservative Judaism. He taught at JTS, but he had to teach 1 year at HUC because he owed that for his rescuers. But he was much more comfortable at conservative seminary reform, so then he said goodbye and moved to New York. You've heard about Abraham Joshua Heschel every year, Martin Luther King Day, because he marched with King. He had that famous line, I'm praying with my feet, marching. But he was one example, and there are others, right? It's not that nobody worked to rescue important Jewish thinkers, in terms of Jewish culture, because that's the most famous example of someone who wasn't. There are many other examples as well. But what she ends up with this great phrase. She says, I couldn't help wishing that instead of an emergency rescue committee saving Europe's greatest artists, that there had been an emergency rescue committee saving Europe's greatest prophets. And perhaps what should have been saved was not more of the culture of Europe, but more people like Varian Fry. That's a great line. That was a great line.
Okay.
That's on page 165. Okay, 2 comments, and then I want to talk about the Oranger book. Yes?
Even today, there's a great conflict between the conservatives and the Hasidim, or the Haredim, and going back into the 1800s, the German Jews who had come earlier hated the Russian Jews who were coming in the 1890s. I can easily imagine not wanting to help the Hasidim.
She's like a revisionist. She's into Yiddish culture and Jewish traditionalism, and so she's like, that's some of the point. It comes through in her epilogue at the end of the book also, like, says Jews should study Talmud more and know that in our authentic culture. So she's taken she's taken a little swipe against the secularized German Jewry also, which I thought it was a cheap shot. Right. Eric.
So this is not a comment, it's a question, it's a comment. We focused on culture, artists, writers, the liberal arts, and I think you mentioned something about scientists. So Einstein came here,
Right.
and I think Bamberger was really involved with bringing him out. Louis Bamberger.
Yeah.
But were scientists part of Fry's? Was he focusing on science at all? Because
It was more culture, because it was really museum philanthropic sponsorship.
The intelligentsia.
Yeah, intelligentsia.
Scientists were coming out from 1930 on.
Yeah, but scientists are going to come through. There's a suggestion of that in the Orange Book. I don't know that, you have to take a list. You can look at all the names that people, I don't know, some of them might be scientists, but that wasn't the focus of what,
and the other part
of what they were doing.
There's a great book by Kati Marton called The Great Escape. Eight giants from Hungary who came out. And
Yeah.
I kind of doubt that Fry was involved with that, but
Yeah.
it's also, no, there were other rescues, smaller.
Good. Okay. So, again, wrapping up Dara Horn's point again, she'll give this talk better than I did because it's her, right? Arnyoma Shoah. But it's a complicated argument that she's making. She's basically using the story of Varian Fry to critique the values of American culture and society as not being there, to save the Jews when they could have, and that's an underlying hint to that underlying anti-Semitism that's not recognized as a surface, which is the same point that she made in the Ellis Island essay, which I talked about, which we did 2 weeks ago, right? That there's this underlying anti-Semitism in America that we don't like to talk about, we don't like to acknowledge that it's there. And that's part of the point of this book, that it's not something that came out of nowhere with the attacks in Pittsburgh synagogue and Roman synagogue. It's something that's always been there under the surface and just came out now. And that's that underneath argument that goes through the whole book, and that's part of the discussion of her complicated treatment of Varian Fry. I want to say a little bit about Julie Oranger's book. Okay, definitely recommend it. This book, unlike Dara Horn's book, there's a lot of words on the page, and there's 570 pages. It's published by Alfred A. Knopf. If you like the physicality of books, this feels nice. It's nice paper, it's got the rough edges on the side, it's got the fancy font that was, a note on the font. This was the typeface from early 16th century with the beautiful things on the top. It's just the way it's produced, which is, again, because she earned that. Because it's her second novel. And her first novel was also Jewish-related with World War II, very well acclaimed. So Cynthia Ozick reviewed this book for the New York Times Book Review, and her basic point was, it's an excellent novel, but it's fiction, and you're not going to learn about Varian Fry, you're just going to learn about her character, Varian. Julie Oringer did serious research, and I don't know that Cynthia, I wouldn't go as far as Cynthia Ozick saying it's completely fictional. Obviously it's a fictional presentation. But she didn't do what Dara Horn did and interview a guy writing a documentary of Fry. She sat for a year in the Columbia University Replica Manuscript Room and read through the 50-some boxes of Varian Fry archives, which his son donated to the Columbia Library. She read through everything there. And researched the whole time period and everything. It's a really fantastic historical novel. It basically tells the story of that 1 year of his life, from the time he starts working in Marseille till the time that he moves back to New York. There are in the book the actual historical figures like Chagall, and others, the artists that he rescued are there in the book. Hiram Bingham, the U.S. consul, is a character in the book. But then there were also purely fictional characters. And one is, because there is the debate over whether he was gay. And somebody mentioned that, so I was going to come to that. And it was, you know, you mentioned Cohn, the mad magician, is a eccentric English apartment guy at Columbia who wrote that historical fiction novel about Thomas Mann's life, and this book. So this is the second book that I read after The Magician, where about a homosexual love affair. So, which took me a little bit out of my comfort zone, you know, in reading that. So it's interesting, the second book, and they're both similar because it goes into Thomas Mann's mindset. And here, he has it's a college sweetheart of his, who he then, the romance reignites when they find each other in the south of France. And so he deals with, but she deals, that's a part of the story because it's, how do you tell the story about the situation of Jews, right, who are the objects of anti-Semitism, the object of mortal persecution by the Nazis, through the story of a wasp from Ridgewood, New Jersey. Right, so she tells the story by talking other avenues of understanding. So one is his experience as a gay man growing up in the first half of the 20th century, you know, and keeping his, and hiding and pretending and passing as someone else. The guy that he has the relationship with is also a black man who passes as white. So she tells that story also. So it deals with homophobia, it deals with racism, and all of that is not. I mean, there is evidence for his for being gay that she cites in her afterwards that Cynthia Ozick doesn't acknowledge. But the other stuff is purely fictional. But they're all related in that sense of dealing with prejudice and your identity and who you are. Which makes it really just a very powerful read, dealing with those meta issues, right, besides the story. It was the day after I recommended it 2 weeks ago that I then got to the point where she goes into a little graphic detail when they actually reignite the romance, and I figured maybe I should not have recommended this book in front of the argument. So that's the warning, okay? But I do want to just share 3 passages, because I don't want to ruin the story, but basically there is a guy that he deals with so I don't want to ruin it for those, I don't want to give a spoiler, but it's about the issue of an artist versus a regular person, and saving a regular person and those moral questions. And it was, Dara Horn addressed it, but I want to just share with you, just to give you a sense of how beautiful that this book is. So one is, he's having a discussion here with Miriam, who's a real person, a historical person who worked with him as one of his associates. And then she's leaving away, and he says, "Why you leave? It's important, so important, because I don't know anything about art." He said, he had no qualifications for this job. So it says, and you're Miriam Davenport saying, "You actually know about art. You have to tell me who's a real artist and who's a fraud." And she said, "I took 1 art appreciation in college. I don't know anything about art either," she said. And then they're arguing. But then she says that she's really just not comfortable with what they're doing. She says, "Listen, Miriam, about that," Miriam lit another cigarette, the umpteenth in a chain. She said, "Don't you think it's rather silly? And not just silly, wrong-headed, or maybe wrong-hearted. I mean, as a basis to decide whether someone lives or dies, because let's be honest, that's what it'll come down to in a lot of these cases. Don't you think a middling artist deserves a chance just as much as a great one does?" As we talked about, right, some of the artists aren't great artists. And then there's also in the story, there's Chagall. There's one of the artists who's a fictional character. His name is Lev Silberman, the book, German Jewish artist. And Chagall in the book comes to Varian Fry and says, "He's a better artist than me. It's not appreciated yet, but I can see his potential. The most important thing you have to do is get him out." And then he doesn't get out. And Fry kills, and it was the person who's the real, and then she plays with that. It's a very sophisticated book, like, is he more of an artist, is he less, is he more important, he's just a human being? So all of those issues come up. 2 more passages, all in the same theme. So here, he's talking with this gangster in Marseille that he works with to, smuggle people out. And then he's trying to get the gangster to go save this person. And so He says, I have reason to believe that this person, I want to find this out. And so he sat back in his chair, sipped his seltzer. He says, dear me, he said, his glass on the desk, and ran his hands over his salted black hair, smoothing it to an otter-like sneakness. Are you concerned, he said, that you put an ordinary young man on the ship Sinaia, someone whose life was worth no more than anyone else's? Because Fry thinks he might have saved someone that was lower down on the list than he should have been. And the gangster is calling into, context Barrymore. Are you that upset that you rescued an ordinary person by accident? And of course, Barry just stands that. And then, this is a conversation with the fictional boyfriend in France. And the boyfriend says, I always says to Varian, I always thought your project was wrong-headed, he said. All that money, all that time, mustered on behalf of people who happen to know how to use a paintbrush or put a sentence together. And don't mistake me. I know the value of art. I like to read and look at paintings as much as the next guy, more than most guys, if you'll believe that. But this is a goddamn war, and they're all human beings. And how can you presume to pick which ones to save and which to throw into the fire? I always thought, I never said it because we were supposedly saving lives, that it was just another binary, another kind of black and white. He's one thing, she's another, so he can be sold as property and she can buy him. How different is it from that, really? And that goes into the homosexuality context and the racism context and all of that. She's tying together, right, in the same moral question, the ethical questions that's brought up. And the last one is a conversation with Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt's also a famous Jewish philosopher who he was instrumental in saving. And she has a conversation with Varian Fry, a fictional conversation in the book. And so he meets her, he says, come up, Miss Arendt, let me introduce you to our secretary. She'll take all your information. Yes, we can find you a doctor, because her husband was sick, and we'll talk about visas for you and your husband. We don't have the influence we used to in that department, but we'll do our best. Miriam was rather stern with me about your case. She made me, Miriam Davenport, in the book, I told her that, his person Hannah Arendt is really, really important. So they said, Miriam was rather stern with me about your case. She made me promise to put out all the stops for you. So Hannah Arendt's eyes rested evenly on Varian's. Pull out all the stops, she repeated. And for a moment he had to wonder if the idiom was different in German. But then she tilted, because he knows that she's a German speaker and he's speaking in English. But then she tilted her head quizzically and said, don't you pull them out for everyone, Herr Fry? She seemed to be asking out of open curiosity, a desire to assess who he was, and he felt himself unable to speak anything but the truth to this frank, sharp-eyed woman, her luminous face like a waxing moon. Perhaps we didn't always in the past, he said, but we've learned the cost of that approach. So, and that's the story, right, of Varian Fry, like, what did he become? What happens to him when he comes back? But also, his legacy continues to move on. And part of Dara Horn's challenge as well is that what can we keep learning? And can our greater American society in general continue to learn from his legacy? So I'm really excited to hear how she gives this talk at Westside Presbyterian Church, because it's going to be a very mixed audience. Right? By definition, right? It's a Jewish and a non-Jewish audience. And in terms of the context of Varian Fry's own church, right, what we can learn from it collectively from him and what that legacy means.
When will that be?
On Yom HaShoah. April 7th.
April 17th?
Yeah, look at the calendar. It's the night of Yom HaShoah. Yeah.
Just on Hannah Arendt, she was a lover of that senior Nazi guy.
Yeah, Hannah Arendt's a very interesting person, absolutely. And you know what, let me give you one more bonus thing, because that reminds me also, and this was related to, Dara Horn's book came out after Julia Oranger's. I don't think she had seen Julia Oranger's book, because it just came out in 2019. So it's unfortunate that Dara Horn didn't acknowledge that, which talks about, people tend not to know about Varian Fry's major novel about it was just published in 2019. But she does acknowledge the question of his sexual orientation, and she has a great and it plays an important part in the novel, you know, and not just to add color to it in more ways than one. But she has this great section, though, because a lot of it is based on his diaries of Kirsten, who was an associate at Harvard, who spoke about him, and said it makes it abundantly clear that Fry was gay, something that nearly everyone in Fry's life seems to have known, though the pieties of the era prevented nearly anyone from admitting it. In Marseille, it was obvious enough that even the Vichy police, trying everything to entrap Fry, sent both girls and boys to seduce him. Then she writes, that's the great passage here, she says, I was raised in an era with its own silly pieties. So just as Annette Fry, that's his wife who has controlled his papers, felt obligated to insert a notice into the papers at Columbia insisting that her husband wasn't foppish, quote unquote, I feel obligated to make one of the two currently pious claims about an important figure's homosexuality. Either that it was irrelevant to his heroism, and that considering it relevant makes one a bigot, or that it was the fundamental influence in creating his sense of empathy for others. That's a great passage. She's saying that as a modern liberal intellectual, those are the two that are completely contradictory, right? It's on page 161 and 162. But then she says that actually neither of those things are true. It's just a part of his life, not necessarily relevant. Julia Oranger, though, does make it a part of the story. And she weaves it into the very complex ethical exploration that she pursues in this book. So that's it for today. Thank you. Let's go to Cincinnati.